law. So they had some false teachers here, and the best we can tell from putting two and two together is that they were teaching that once you become a Christian, you don't have any moral obligations. That Jesus has washed you up and cleaned you up so much that you don't have to worry about anything anymore. You just go do whatever you want to. Have at it. Do what you want. You're not under any moral obligations anymore. You're not under any kind of law. Not the law of Moses, not the law of grace, nothing that God has said or Jesus has said really pertains to you. You do what you want. This was one of the main tenets of early Gnostics and Nicolaitans. And we've talked about Gnostics quite a bit in here. The Gnostics taught that spiritual enlightenment, that's the word gnosis that I have there in yellow. The word gnosis sounds a lot like know, doesn't it? K-N-O-W. Sounds a lot like it. Well, that's where we get that word. The Gnostics taught that spiritual enlightenment freed believers from the constraints of moral law. Now, the Gnostics believed that they got some kind of supernatural spirit, if you will, that not everybody got. That you common everyday Christians didn't get this. That just a few people got it. Got this special knowledge bestowed on them by God. And they believed that if you had this spiritual enlightenment, that you were freed from the moral constraints of the law. The Nicolaitans, and those are mentioned in Revelation, and you probably recognize it if you've been reading Revelation. The Nicolaitans taught that since salvation was by grace, believers could indulge in sin without consequence. So once you're a Christian, grace has got you covered, don't even worry. Perhaps it was held by some of those to whom John wrote that all that was necessary to constitute religion was to believe the doctrines of Christianity. Now, think about that, because I think there are people today that still believe the same thing. Perhaps it was held by some of those to whom John wrote that all that was necessary to constitute religion was to believe the doctrines of Christianity. Just believe that Jesus was the Christ, that what he taught was correct, that the Christian doctrines are correct, but you're not really constrained to participate in it. You just believe it. Even though one might not bother practicing them. Perhaps they believe that Jesus came to modify the law. That's an interesting thought. Perhaps they believe that Jesus came to modify the law, thereby giving more freedom to live as they chose. In other words, they've been under the law of Moses. They looked at the law of Moses, they said, boy, there's just too many laws here. I don't want to have to obey this law of Moses. I don't have to be under all these constraints. So when Jesus came, he kind of loosened it up, made it more easy. So they felt like they're still under this law maybe, but that the law had been loosened up and it wasn't going to be as strict anymore. So maybe that's how they saw Jesus. But in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, Jesus said, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them." In other words, I'm not taking the law. That's not my purpose. My purpose is not to get rid of law, but to fulfill them. So that wasn't his purpose. His purpose wasn't to keep us from being under any kind of law. Perhaps they believe that since Christians are heirs of all things, they were free to enjoy all things. You know, we're heirs of all things, and I see a bunch of stuff out there that people are doing. Why can't I be a part of that? Why can't I indulge in that? So all of these things are possibilities. Here's what we can conclude from chapter 3, verses 4 and 5. That there is a rule of law by which our conduct is regulated and to which it is to be conformed. Not like the law of Moses. We don't have just a list after list after list after list of things that you can do and what you can't do. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a law. Jesus taught a moral law. It's just presented in a different way. And that's how our conduct is to be regulated. And that's how we're to conform to God's will, is by studying and seeing what's pleasing to God and what's not pleasing to God. I think of it more in this way. If you have parents that love you, and of course we all know that when you're teenagers, you're going to rebel against daddy and mama a little bit. And you know, sometimes you do it and you know you're doing the wrong thing. But at some point in your life, when you reach maturity and you still got your parents, and they haven't been abusive, you've been in a good home, they've loved you, they still love you, and you have learned through this maturing process what your parents desire. You know it. They don't have to write it down, but from the way they've lived their lives, the things they've said, what they taught you when you're growing up, and even after you're an adult, you know what they want. And you conform yourself to that. Why? Why do you do it? Are you afraid of losing your inheritance? Probably not. Probably not. We're not afraid of losing our inheritance if we don't behave in a way that maybe the mom and daddy would approve of. But we do conform to what they taught us. Why? Because we love them. Because we love them. We want to be pleasing to them. That's the kind of relationship that a Christian has to God. Second point, there is sin in cases where there is no compliance with that law, and when this compliance is not met, there's guilt before God. So we know what God wants. When we willingly or even ignorantly violate that, we're guilty. The particular thing which determines the guilt of sin and which measures it is that it is a departure from law, and consequently that there is no sin where there's no departure from law. So, you know, how are we going to know this law? How are we going to know? Familiarizing ourselves with the Bible, particularly the New Testament, the teachings of Jesus, the doctrines of the church as presented by the apostles in the letters in the New Testament. That's how we learn what God wants, what God desires, and the thing that determines whether we're guilty or not is whether we put ourselves in compliance with that or not. And that last phrase, there's no sin where there's no departure from law. Have you ever heard anybody say, Well, that's just wrong. And you think, I don't believe there's a teaching in the Bible that specifically says that's wrong. And in fact, there's not even a principle in the Bible that teaches that's wrong. That's just somebody's opinion that that's wrong. There's no sin if there's no departure from law. And we may also infer that God has an absolute right to prescribe what we may or may not do. And He's the only one. God is our creator. He's the only one that has the right to determine what's right and what's wrong and what He wants His creatures to do. That what He prescribes will be in accordance with what is right. Whatever God tells you to do is not going to be unfair. And it's not going to be unjust. It's certainly not going to be wrong. Whatever God says is right because of His nature. He can't be anything but right. That nothing else other than what God has said is right is wrong, that you should do or that you should not do. That there's nothing else that you can contrive or make up yourself that's a sin. Nothing else, in fact, is a sin. Sin cannot exist outside the guidelines and principles that are set forth by God. We don't get to make the rules. Now, sometimes we get it in our mind that we can. And we start making lists. Well, here's what you have to do, and here's what you don't have to do. And sometimes you really can't find things on that list. You can't find them in the Scripture. And the last thing is sin always has a penalty. Sin always has a penalty. You may say, well, it wasn't much of a sin. Well, you know, a little bitty thing. Well, it has a penalty. If it's sin, it has a penalty. So either you're going to be punished for it, or somebody else is going to be punished for it. And that person is Jesus Christ. He's punished for every sin that we commit. All right, any comments? All right, let's go to verses 6 through 8. No one who lives in Him keeps on sinning. No one who continues to sin has either seen Him or known Him. Dear children, do not let anyone lead you astray. The one who does what is right is righteous, just as he is righteous. The one who does what is sinful is of the devil, because the devil has been sinning from the beginning. The reason that the Son of God appeared was to destroy the devil's work. All right. 1 John 3:6. Let me turn to that in this real quick. Now, if you look in the King James, well, you look in the NIV. Well, let me take that back. In the King James, verse 6. Whoso abideth in Him sinneth not. Whosoever sinneth hath not seen Him, neither known Him. New American Standard, no one who abides in Him sins. No one who sins has seen Him or knows Him. Let's see. Christian Standard, everyone who remains in Him does not sin, the Bible in basic English, anyone who is in him does no sin. Do you see there's a lot of difference in these different translations? You read along, and if you're reading, I think I read 5 different versions. 3 of them say something like, anyone who is in him does no sin. And if you're reading along there, and you really never studied this topic before, that's going to scare you to death. It ought to. Anyone who's in him does no sin. Well, it's mistranslated. It's just mistranslated. Remember what I said about the King James? Verse 6, whosoever abideth in him sinneth not. That little ETH simply means sins and keeps on sinning. Just like I became a Christian and I'm not changing my behavior. I'm just going to keep on keeping on the way I've always done. I'm not going to worry about sin. I'm just going to keep sinning. Of course, you wouldn't say it. You would say that out loud. But that might be your attitude. So, when he says keeps on sinning, John, can you do my slide for me back there? There we go. Thanks. When he says keeps on sinning, he's not contradicting himself. If you read the whole book, you know he's already said that anyone who claims to be without sin is a liar. Chapter 1, verse 8. So he says, anyone who says, I don't ever sin, John says that person is a liar. And then he says, here, anyone who sins, whoever abides in him doesn't sin. Well, how do you put those two things together? Because it doesn't mean that you never sin. It means that you don't continue in a sinful lifestyle, that your life is not represented. People don't look at you and say, that person's a sinner. His lifestyle is a sinful lifestyle. He has already said that anyone who claims to be without sin is a liar. I'm convinced that many people have put off becoming Christians because they fear they can't stop sinning. I've had this conversation with people before, and I say, well, I'd like to be a Christian, but I'm not ready yet. Now, the first thing they're going to say is, I don't know enough. Then they're going to say, well, I'm still engaged in sinful activity. I'm not ready to give that up yet. I don't think I can stop committing sin. I think people have put off because they fear that they can't stop sinning. And they think that they're going to reach a point in their life where they've got such control over themselves that they can become a Christian and not ever sin again. That ain't going to happen. Nobody can stop sinning. However, a Christian's life is not characterized by sin. Gonna slip up? Yeah. Gonna slip up occasionally. But our lives are not characterized by sin, and the Christian does not habitually engage in sinful activity. He does his best to avoid sin and to resist temptation. He does not put himself in situations where he might be tripped up. And I think that's one of the problems of everybody, Christians and non-Christians alike, is that we put ourselves in situations where we might be tempted to do something that we know is wrong. Verse 7 says, "Dear children, do not let anyone lead you astray. He who does what is right is righteous, just as he is righteous." Verse 7 alludes, I believe, to the false teachers that were among them. They were teaching that a Christian could be saved without pursuing a pure and godly life. John makes it clear here that a person is righteous when he does right. Let's read that again. Verse 7. Dear children, do not let anyone lead you astray. In other words, don't let these teachers get in your ear. And this is just as clear as it can be. He who does what is right is righteous. Who's a righteous person? A person that does the right thing. That's what this means. A person that does the right thing. We're confronted with hundreds of situations every day, whether you can do the right thing or you can do the wrong thing. Which one does the righteous person do? He chooses the right thing. Righteous people are characterized by lives lived according to the precepts of Jesus. And he says, just as he is righteous, Jesus is our example of how to live a righteous life. So we choose to be righteous, and our standard is Jesus. All right, again in verse 8, he who does what is sinful is of the devil, because the devil has been sinning from the beginning. The reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the devil's work. John speaks of a life characterized by sin. It is only reasonable that anyone who becomes a Christian is going to attempt to do what Jesus taught and put away a sinful activity. Think about that. When a person becomes a Christian, it's illogical for him to continue to live the kind of life that he's lived before. It's reasonable that anyone who becomes a Christian is going to try to live by what Jesus taught. He will sin occasionally, and provision has been made for that. 1 John 2:1, if anyone does sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous one. The righteous one. Jesus is the only one that's truly righteous, and he is our advocate. He who continues in sin is of the devil. And I've got there in yellow print, John 8:44, you belong to your father, this is Jesus speaking, you belong to your father the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there's no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language. When he lies, he speaks his native language. For he is a liar and the father of lies. So John says that the devil has been sinning from the beginning. I don't know when that was. I think it means shortly after he was created, because the devil is a created being. Hey, somebody might say, oh, wait a minute. You mean God created Satan? Yes, God created Satan. But I thought God couldn't be in the presence of evil. He didn't create him evil. Satan was an angel who rebelled against God. This says that he was sinning from the beginning, and I think shortly after he was created. But it could refer to the Garden of Eden. And we know the story of Satan in the Garden of Eden, so it might be talking about that, I don't know. Jesus had to come to earth to destroy the work of Satan. And there's a lot we could say about Satan. I'm not going to go into it too much, but there's a lot we could say about Satan, but Satan is the reason that there is sin, and everybody engages in it. And the only way to get sin, to remove sin from God's creatures was for Jesus to come to earth and to give himself as an innocent sacrifice on our behalf. Okay, so we'll stop, and next week we'll begin with verse 9. I hope you have a good